When we think of the Crusades, the first images that come to mind are often the warrior monarchs and leaders, a religious war that burned for centuries, and the pointless grabbing of someone else's land in the name of your deity of choice. But what about the women, the queens and princesses, the daughters and wives? One of these women was born into the conflict-ridden world of the Crusader kingdoms, into one of Jerusalem's royal families, and much like the Crusader kingdoms, she would embody both its rise and catastrophic fall. Sibylla of Jerusalem. Sibylla was born around 1160 into the heart of Jerusalem's royal family during a time when the Crusader kingdom faced constant uncertainty. Her father, then known as Amalric, Count of Jaffa and Ascalon, would become known as King Amalric I. He was an energetic leader, known for his relentless efforts to safeguard and expand the kingdom amidst the rising threats from Muslim leaders, particularly from the ambitious and increasingly powerful Saladin. Her mother, Agnes of Courtenay, hailed from a noble Frankish family, the Franks being the ruling class of the Crusader states, with extensive French and English branches, making Sibylla part of a deeply influential and politically entangled lineage. On top of this, she was niece to the then King of Jerusalem, Baldwin III, and was a granddaughter of the first female ruler of Jerusalem, Queen Melisande. From a young age, Sibylla's future was shaped by both promise and uncertainty. When she was still a child, her parents' marriage was annulled. This was due to the death of Baldwin III, leading to Amalric being voted in as king, but the council would only accept Amalric as king if he agreed to put Agnes aside. Unsurprisingly, when he took the offer but ensured their two children would remain legitimate, this led to her mother Agnes withdrawing from royal life. As there was no longer a queen's presence at court, it was deemed unsuitable for Sibylla to stay as well. At just 4 years old, Sibylla was sent to the convent of St. Lazarus near Jerusalem under the watchful guidance of her great-aunt, the Abbess Ioveta of Bethany. This was in keeping with medieval Western practices of sending royal children to the households of other relatives, and it meant Sibylla had little contact not only with her mother, but also with her father or brother. Under Ioveta's tutelage, Sibylla received an education heavily influenced by the religious and moral virtues expected of royalty. She learned Latin and French, developed skills in court etiquette, embroidery, singing, how to hunt with a hawk and use a bow, and was immersed in the religious piety that was central to her family's identity as rulers of a Christian kingdom in a predominantly Muslim region. However, this isolation from court didn't mean Sibylla was free of its politics. King Amalric was worried that he would die young like his father and brother, and his son was still only a minor who was suspected from the age of 9 to have leprosy. This would turn out to be true, and while the young boy would later become Baldwin IV, having leprosy meant he would never be allowed to marry or have children. Therefore, Amalric understood his son could rule after him, but that he would be unable to produce his own heir, leaving his daughter Sibylla as the next choice. Unlike many other places in the Western world, Jerusalem was no stranger to female rulers, and Sibylla was the eldest of Amalric's children. But due to the militaristic nature of ruling the Crusader states, she was still required to have a husband who could take on this role for her. The problem was, it needed to be someone willing to be co-ruler only, and that was only if Sibylla gained the throne at all. He also had to have a high enough rank, experience in government as well as war, and not be closely related to Sibylla, a surprisingly tall order at the time. Her father chose Stephen I of Sancerre, brother-in-law to King Louis VII of France, who came to Jerusalem in 1171. While he had a noble family on all sides, according to William of Tyre, his behaviour was less than noble. Whatever the details of this meant, Stephen backed out of the arranged marriage after a few months, most likely because he couldn't agree on what kind of power he would hold as Sibylla's husband, especially if she never became queen. It's also possible he was nervous about Sibylla's legitimacy being revoked due to her parents' separation. No one was impressed with him calling it off. But events abruptly shattered in 1174 with the sudden death of King Amalric, plunging the kingdom into crisis, his worst fears of dying young and leaving a son too young to rule alone. Sibylla's brother Baldwin ascended the throne at just 13 years of age, burdened already by his leprosy, an illness that cast a long shadow over his reign and future. Baldwin's deteriorating health immediately publicly thrust young Sibylla into the spotlight as the next viable heir, instead of her being a shadowy second option. The kingdom's leading nobles and clergymen swiftly recognized that the continuity of Jerusalem's fragile dynasty depended significantly on Sibylla's preparedness to rule. Thus, her education, grooming, and eventual marriage became matters of urgent political importance, transforming her overnight from a protected royal child into a central figure on whom the survival of the entire Crusader kingdom rested. However, Sibylla was still young herself, was inexperienced, and had spent most of her life in an abbey. But the issue of a fitting husband still persisted, as marrying any of the barons in the kingdom would have created internal divisions, and Sibylla was related to any others in Jerusalem who might have worked. A match needed to be chosen from other royal houses in Europe, but as that would take time, Baldwin was accepted to the throne with the understanding he would be succeeded by his sister. Initially, the council set its sights on a European nobleman with a strong pedigree and strategic influence, William of Montferrat, known as William Longsword, from an influential crusading family in northern Italy. William had significant credentials for the match. His father had fought prominently in the Second Crusade, and he was also related to Louis VII of France as his cousin, as well as cousin to Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, thereby providing potentially invaluable connections to European royalty and military support. He arrived in Jerusalem in October 1176, a prestigious and welcome candidate for the young princess's hand. However, many of the barons were less impressed with William when he arrived, as his cousin the emperor had lost a number of recent battles and could no longer be counted on for as much military support. However, it would have been unthinkable for Sibylla to have another proposed marriage aborted, so the wedding went ahead. For Sibylla, this would have been a big change. Having spent most of her childhood cloistered away from court, her new reality was defined by public spectacle and political pressure. Yet contemporary accounts such as those of William of Tyre suggest she rose quickly to her new role, adapting to court life and managing the heavy expectations placed upon her with remarkable maturity for her age. Her marriage to William of Montferrat in November 1176 was celebrated in Jerusalem, a ceremony clearly designed not only as a joyous occasion, but also as a political statement to the kingdom's allies and adversaries alike. Sibylla was now formally and publicly established as Baldwin's heir presumptive. But the marriage was brief. Tragically, within months, William became seriously ill. Some historical sources speculate malaria or dysentery, both common and deadly illnesses in the region at the time. He died in June 1177, barely half a year after marrying Sibylla, leaving her pregnant with their only child. Suddenly, at 16 or 17 years old, Sibylla found herself a widow, alone and vulnerable once more, yet carrying within her the kingdom's future in the form of her unborn child. Her position now became simultaneously precarious and essential. As mother to the unborn heir, her own safety, security, and position took on an even greater political significance. In order to protect her from European leaders eager to make moves for their own benefit, the High Court declared that, especially in view of Sibylla still being with child, she would be given a full year of mourning before another marriage was even considered. She gave birth later that same year in the winter, naming the child Baldwin after her brother. The birth of a healthy son was met with widespread relief across the Crusader kingdom, as Baldwin V now became the next certain link in the dynastic chain. Sibylla was no longer merely the king's sister, she was now the mother of Jerusalem's future ruler. Yet this new status only intensified her challenges. As a young, unmarried mother of the heir presumptive, Sibylla became an even more valuable political commodity, and the pressure to remarry quickly resurfaced with urgency. Following William's death, Jerusalem's nobles debated fervently over the selection of Sibylla's next husband. Factional divides emerged clearly, reflecting the kingdom's precarious internal political landscape. One faction, led notably by Raymond III of Tripoli, advocated caution and patience in the selection process, prioritizing a candidate with proven political and military experience. The opposing faction, including Sibylla's mother Agnes, who had returned to court at the same time as her daughter, fostering a strong relationship with her and Baldwin IV, was eager for a swift and decisive choice that would bolster their own influence at court. Duke Hugh III of Burgundy was the preferred choice, and he was due to sail out to marry Sibylla when conflict exploded in France and prevented him leaving. But into this volatile political scene stepped Guy of Lusignan, a young French nobleman who arrived in Jerusalem around 1180. He was strikingly handsome, ambitious, and from a reputable family in Poitou. But he lacked the political and military experience many felt necessary to co-govern Jerusalem. Despite this, or perhaps partly because of his inexperience, which might render him easier to influence, Guy quickly gained favour with Agnes and her supporters. Sibylla herself appears to have been personally attracted to Guy, though contemporary chroniclers debate how willingly she entered this second marriage. Baldwin IV, at first distrustful of Guy's political intentions and capability, came around when he heard of plots against him that involved forcing Sibylla to marry and give up the throne. Sibylla's own feelings about the marriage remain somewhat unclear historically, though her acceptance suggests a blend of political necessity, personal attraction, and resignation to the reality of her position. Her marriage to Guy in early 1180 was formalized rapidly, reshaping Jerusalem's political landscape virtually overnight. From this moment, Sibylla's life became intricately bound to Guy's fortunes. As she was still the Countess of Jaffa and Ascalon, Guy became Count of the same lands, and they would go on to have 4 daughters together. While her first marriage had briefly secured external support, this second marriage sharply divided the kingdom internally, setting the stage for bitter factional struggles. With Sibylla's marriage, Jerusalem plunged into one of the most turbulent and politically fraught periods in its brief but dramatic history. Guy's sudden elevation to royal consort sent shockwaves through the kingdom's nobility. He was young, handsome, and charismatic, qualities which initially endeared him to Sibylla, but his political inexperience, coupled with a reputation for arrogance and impulsiveness, soon alienated many influential figures at court. Baldwin IV, known as the Leper King, had fought tirelessly against the progression of his disease. But by 1180, his illness was severe, causing visible physical decline and limiting his ability to govern actively. Sibylla and Guy began to be connected publicly from March 1181 to act on behalf of the king. His worsening condition sharpened fears of instability among the kingdom's barons, magnifying the importance of the succession issue. By 1183, the king, still only in his 20s, had gone blind and could no longer walk without support. Baldwin's anxiety was deepened by his awareness of Guy's inadequacies, particularly after witnessing his inability to handle crucial military responsibilities. In 1183, Guy was entrusted with defending Jerusalem against Saladin attacking Kerak Castle, while a celebration went on for the wedding of Sibylla's half-sister Isabella, but chose cautious inaction rather than decisive leadership, greatly diminishing his credibility. Baldwin responded furiously, publicly humiliating Guy by stripping him of his military responsibilities and his regency, which meant he was no longer in line for the throne, even if he was married to Sibylla. This embarrassing episode reflected poorly on Sibylla as well, placing her in the uncomfortable position of having to defend a husband increasingly seen as unreliable. Amid this tense climate, Baldwin sought to secure a stable succession that would avoid placing too much immediate power in Guy's hands. Recognizing Sibylla's young son by William of Montferrat, Baldwin V, as a less controversial heir, the king attempted to establish clear regency arrangements. His intention was transparent: to bypass Guy and partially limit Sibylla's influence, safeguarding the kingdom from her husband's potential recklessness. For Sibylla, this public rebuke of her husband created considerable emotional strain. She found herself trapped between loyalty to her brother, the dying king, and her husband, who increasingly demanded her unwavering support. The king attempted to have the marriage annulled, but Sibylla was devoted to her husband, and the couple refused to attend court to prevent it happening. Baldwin then tried to confiscate his sister's lands, but was only able to do it for Jaffa. Sibylla's personal life mirrored the kingdom's turmoil. She had entered adulthood amid immense pressure, her every move scrutinized. Now she faced additional personal difficulties. Chroniclers of the time, such as William of Tyre and Ernul, portray Sibylla as increasingly isolated. She lived in a divided household, one where Baldwin's supporters openly challenged her husband's legitimacy and authority, while Guy's faction saw Baldwin's efforts as interference driven by personal prejudice and jealousy. Sibylla's mother became a crucial ally, advocating fiercely for Sibylla's rights and dignity, but Agnes's polarizing influence further intensified court divisions. The situation worsened dramatically in late 1183 when Baldwin IV's health took another sharp downturn. Recognizing the gravity of his condition, Baldwin convened the kingdom's High Council and made a desperate, calculated move to consolidate stability. He crowned Sibylla's 5-year-old son, Baldwin V, as co-king, formally sidelining both Sibylla and Guy from immediate succession. This political maneuver was strategic and symbolic. By elevating a child king, Baldwin intended to neutralize Guy's immediate influence, transferring authority temporarily to trusted nobles who would rule as regents during Baldwin V's minority. This development put Sibylla in a difficult position. On the one hand, she was the king's sister and the mother of his chosen heir, securing her place at the heart of dynastic legitimacy. On the other, she was also effectively stripped of immediate political power, her own succession rights suspended indefinitely. Her future now rested entirely upon the survival and health of her fragile young son. Furthermore, Baldwin's decision demonstrated his lack of faith in Guy's suitability, a judgment that would inevitably shape the kingdom's perception of Sibylla's own legitimacy as queen. To complicate matters further, Baldwin's move stirred significant opposition among Sibylla's supporters. Agnes's faction viewed the regency arrangement as an insult to Sibylla's birthright, intensifying factional rivalries into outright hostility. Unlike other European kingdoms, the fact Sibylla was a woman was not a bar to entry for the crown, provided she had a suitable husband to take care of military problems for her, and therefore she was technically the next in line. The kingdom's most powerful barons, particularly Raymond III of Tripoli, openly opposed Sibylla and Guy, strengthening court divisions. Raymond had long mistrusted Guy and saw Sibylla as compromised by her marriage, making her increasingly vulnerable to baronial intrigue and potential political isolation. But on his deathbed in 1185, Baldwin offered the position of regent to Raymond, who only took it on the condition that the Pope should make the decision, with advice from other royal figures, whether the crown would pass to Sibylla or her half-sister Isabella if the young boy king died while still underage. Raymond and his followers advocated openly for Isabella, as they claimed Sibylla was illegitimate due to her parents' separation. Baldwin IV died in March 1185, or by the 16th of May 1885 at the latest, and his death left the kingdom fragile and dangerously divided. Sibylla, still officially sidelined, now faced an uncertain path toward the throne. Her son, Baldwin V, reigned briefly, but sadly would not last long. Sometime between May and September 1186, just the following year, young Baldwin died in Acre of unknown causes. Considering his fragile health and the era in which he lived, it's likely the little boy died of one of the many medieval illnesses that were around, but there were a few chroniclers hostile to Raymond and his followers who claimed the boy had been poisoned. Sibylla, who paid for an elaborate tomb for her young son, rushed to Acre to be present at her son's funeral, although it wasn't her only reason for going. By that point, Agnes had also died, leaving Sibylla in a strange position. On the one hand, she should have had less backup, but on the other, Agnes's followers now fully rallied around her daughter. There was a hint of things to come in the fact that Sibylla and Guy both came and garrisoned the city with an enormous army, and she had good reason to start shoring up her interests. Her position was both clear and contentious. She was now the undisputed senior heir to the throne by birthright, yet the kingdom's barons remained bitterly divided about the legitimacy of her claim, largely because of her husband, Guy. Raymond summoned a high court attended by several nobles, but notably also by Sibylla's half-sister Isabella and many members of Raymond's family. This was problematic for many reasons, not least because it hinted either that Raymond planned to claim the throne for himself, or that he was still going to push his support for Isabella, in which case it was a little messed up either of them being there. But he underestimated the support for Sibylla herself once Guy was taken out of the equation. They all agreed Sibylla was the best fit for the throne, but didn't want Guy near it. Then, the solution seemed simple. Much like her own parents, Sibylla could be offered the throne if she agreed to give up her spouse. Now, aside from the obvious deep connection between Sibylla and Guy, she had grown up seeing the problems caused by her own mother being put aside by her father. Nevertheless, she proposed a counter-argument. She would agree to take the throne and leave Guy, but only if the legitimacy of their daughters was recognised. Guy got to keep Jaffa and Ascalon, and Sibylla would be free to choose who she wanted as her third husband. The conditions were agreed to, and her coronation was planned for mid-September at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Raymond and his party all refused to attend, and in the slim chance they might, the city gates were barred to them. But of course, Sibylla had a trick up her sleeve. She was proclaimed queen by the citizens of Jerusalem instead of the attendees and crowned. Then the Patriarch of Jerusalem, Heraclius, gave her a second crown and asked who she had chosen as her next husband. According to the contemporary Chronicle of Ernul, which likely dramatized events somewhat, Sibylla called for Guy to join her at the altar and crowned him as her choice of husband. Nowhere had the nobles thought to say she couldn't remarry her second husband when choosing. It was a bold move. Not only was it a direct jab at those on the council who had attempted to remove her husband, but it was also Sibylla dramatically showing who was in charge. However, the move also, predictably, shattered the fragile unity her brother Baldwin had fought hard to create during his lifetime. Her supporters praised her ingenuity and choice of king consort. Raymond and his followers refused to acknowledge Guy at all, and a further section of nobles were glad to have Sibylla, but disappointed with her choice of crowning Guy. However, the barons were eventually convinced to swear fealty, except for Raymond and Baldwin of Ibelin, who refused. Initially, the Count of Tripoli tried to suggest crowning Sibylla's half-sister Isabella and her husband Humphrey as rival monarchs, but everyone could see this would lead nowhere good. Humphrey snuck into Jerusalem, secured an audience with the new queen, and also agreed to pay homage to her. However, the queen was only as good as the king consort who could defend her lands militarily, and sadly, Guy was about to prove he was not the man for the job. For the first few months of Sibylla's reign, everything seemed to go well, and the couple were publicly seen carrying out royal acts together. But then, on the 26th of April 1187, Saladin attacked the city, bolstered by Raymond having allied with Saladin and garrisoned Tiberias in his lands with Muslim troops. However, after the defeat of the Templars and the Hospitallers at Cresson near Nazareth on the 1st May, Raymond switched sides again and swore homage to Guy. The kingdom was united again, but weakened by the defeats. Sadly for Guy, his lack of military prowess again got him into trouble, when at the Battle of the Horns of Hattin on the 4th of July, his army was dealt a crushing defeat by Saladin's forces, and Guy himself was taken prisoner. Not only had much of the kingdom fallen to Saladin, but now the queen's husband had been captured, although he was well treated as a king. Sibylla travelled with her daughters to Ascalon and sent appeals to Saladin to release Guy in exchange for surrendering the city. She relented the city, but Guy wasn't released, unsurprisingly, since none of the appeals were apparently in her name. In September of that year, Raymond of Tripoli died in his lands and Saladin besieged Jerusalem. With the help of her advisors, Sibylla attempted to defend the city, but was unsuccessful and it fell like so many others. By the following year, all the Holy Land had fallen under the military might of Saladin, leaving only Tyre as the final hold of the Crusaders. But Sibylla was at least reunited with Guy in 1188. She never gave up petitioning the Sultan for his release, and it was finally granted in July. The couple finally met again on the island of Arwad near Tortosa, where they then travelled to Antioch and Tripoli to gather an army. They finally marched to Tyre in April 1189, expecting to be allowed into the last stronghold of the land Sibylla was apparently queen of. However, there was a snag. Tyre was held by Conrad of Montferrat, brother of Sibylla's first husband, and he had defended the city mercilessly, to the extent he was respected on both sides. He refused to let the couple enter when they demanded the keys, stating that Guy had forfeited any right to a crown when he had lost at the Battle of Hattin in 1187, and that as per the will of Baldwin IV, he was holding the city until Henry II of England, Philip II of France, and the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick I could make a decision on who the true rightful heir to the now increasingly fragmented kingdom was. But he did let them camp outside the walls. The Third Crusade was launched in 1189 as a response to the multiple losses, and Conrad was persuaded to join Guy in the siege of Acre. Sibylla and her daughters also travelled there, along with many other members of her family, but this would be a fatal mistake. At some point in 1190, a vicious epidemic struck the Crusaders' camp, and many fell ill, including the Queen. Just a few days after her two daughters, Alice and Maria, Sibylla died on the 25th of July. Guy no longer had any claim to a crown, and the next heir to what was left of the throne was Sibylla's half-sister Isabella. Obviously, this created a mess of unrivaled proportions. Despite having no claim to the throne except through his now-deceased wife, Guy refused to step down. Conrad saw his opportunity and stepped into the ring in dramatic fashion, separating from his second wife and convincing Isabella to ditch Humphrey and marry him instead. They argued for an annulment on the grounds that Isabella had been too young to give consent at the time of her marriage. Although, as she was fond of Humphrey, it's highly unlikely she wanted to take part in this new marriage. On top of this, a divorce must have been quickly obtained as Conrad's second wife Theodora was still alive, and the church appears to have been convinced to look the other way at the fact Conrad was technically Isabella's brother-in-law, something that normally triggered instant disapproval as they viewed it as akin to an actual brother. Things would deteriorate from there, but Sibylla's part in events was now silent. Commentators at the time were divided on their opinions of her. Those against her claimed she was foolish and sentimental, far too engrossed in her romantic relationship with Guy to be of any real use as a queen. Those aligned with Sibylla stated that standing by her husband was something they admired, and was a reflection of her steadfast and noble character to be commended for her virtue and courage. The reality is probably somewhere in between. Was she overly infatuated with Guy? No, not really. She was in love with him and understandably wanted him safe. Was she also a good ruler? Reasonably so. She held the barons united even while her lands slipped away, which suggests that while military losses were huge, something about her as a person rallied the nobles as her brother once had. Ultimately, Sibylla's legacy remains complicated by the political divisions she created. She had navigated her queenship through one of Jerusalem's most turbulent eras, characterized by difficult decisions, internal divisions, and ultimately devastating loss. Modern historians acknowledge her resilience in circumstances marked by relentless pressure, though they also highlight the severe consequences of her decisions, particularly her controversial crowning of Guy, which exacerbated the kingdom's factional conflicts at a critical moment. Her life and reign continue to symbolize both the promise and tragic vulnerabilities of the Crusader kingdom, ensuring that her memory remains closely linked to one of the most dramatic episodes in medieval history, the fall of Jerusalem itself. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss any new documentaries.